Welcome to our second part in our review series for the Pedagogy and Professional Responsibilities, or PPR exam in Texas. It's one of the mandatory exams that you will need to pass if you want to be a teacher in public schools in Texas. This will also serve as an excellent review for my students in my Educational Foundations class. Let's start. First, let's discuss Competency 2. Promoting multiculturalism and diversity in Texas schools. Success for all students. The focus of Competency 2 is for Texas teachers to understand student diversity and how they can effectively plan learning experiences and assessments that will ensure that all students learn. If you would like to read it specifically word for word, you can see it below. Now let's discuss what is diversity. Diversity can be in terms of ethnicity or ethnic group. You can have students of diverse cultures and diverse races. You could have students of diverse religions. And you could also have students that have diverse gender identities and language backgrounds. When we talk about language backgrounds, we also often talk about students who are English language learners, whose language is something other than English as their home language. You could also have students, and you will have students, with diverse learning styles and different learning abilities or aptitudes. There could be diversity in terms of physical abilities, and also diversity of sexual orientations. Our first topic in today's lesson will be gender diversity in K-12 schools. It's important to understand the laws that support gender equality in U.S. schools. In 1972, a fundamental law was passed, Title IX of the Educational Amendment Act. Title IX stipulated that there could be no discrimination based on someone's sex or gender. There would be equal educational opportunities for women in education, and there would be equal funding for male and female activities, including sports. Thus, schools had to have the same number of male sports to female sports, and they also had to provide the same amount of funding to both male sports and female sports. Educators need to be aware of the gender academic achievement gap. And just to explain it in more simpler terms, the gender academic achievement gap pertains to the difference in academic achievement between males and females. Often, it's described in terms of male and female achievement in the different academic subjects such as math, science, language arts, and social studies. According to educational data and research, girls and boys enter kindergarten at the same level in both math and reading. However, by the end of kindergarten, as you can see in the graphic, boys start to score significantly higher on academic achievement tests in math and science. However, something that's interesting to note is that in terms of grades, boys, despite their higher scores on math and science tests, have lower grades in all three subjects. In terms of language arts and reading, girls outperform boys in reading starting at the end of kindergarten. Here is another chart that documents the gender academic achievement gap. As you can see, the academic achievement gap widens as students get older. As students get older, women in general start performing even higher compared to boys on reading standardized tests. Something that's interesting to note is that at 9 years of age, which is around third grade, girls actually were performing slightly higher in math than boys. Yet a year later, when they became 10, and then also when they were 17-year-olds, boys start to outperform girls on math standardized achievement tests. This time we're measuring it through the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP, which we'll be using on other slides as well, so it's something to note. To summarize the data that we've discussed in earlier slides, girls outperform boys in reading and writing standardized tests. Boys outperform girls after the third grade in math and science standardized achievement tests. In terms of AP scores or advanced placement exams, males score higher on AP exams except for the foreign language AP exams. Something that's positive to note is that the achievement gap between boys and girls is decreasing. When you consider students that are performing below grade level in all three subjects, math, science, and language arts, boys are more represented. They are more likely to be performing below grade level. 15% of boys are performing below grade level in all of those three subjects, while only 9% of girls are performing below grade level in all three subjects. Something else the data discusses is that even though girls might be top performing and high achieving in math, they're more likely to doubt their own math abilities. Boys, on the other hand, are more likely to be disengaged with their schoolwork. They're also less likely to complete homework, and they're less likely to read for pleasure. When they do read for pleasure, the books that they read are likely to not be as challenging as the books that girls read. In terms of college graduation rates, there are 25% more females that graduate college than males. Females, though, are less likely to choose majors in math and science. Research also shows that in terms of science experiments, women are much more likely to hold passive roles such as the note taker or the lab report writer, while males are more likely to have active roles such as being in charge of the materials and the actual lab experiment itself. Furthermore, teachers are more likely to call on boys than in girls in math and science classes. Males are in general receive more positive and negative reinforcement from their teachers. So this could be both positive praise for a job well done, or it could also be negative redirection for misbehavior or poor performance. Males are often more likely to dominate discussions. However, when girls are participating in single-sex classrooms, so all-girl classrooms or schools, they are more likely to participate in classroom discussions. Research also shows that teachers, unfortunately, have misconceptions and biases when it comes to the abilities of different genders. So even when students have the same socioeconomic background, behavior, history, and academic achievement level, teachers are more likely to consider that males have more mathematical abilities. Teachers do believe that girls can score at the same level as boys, but they preface this by saying that only if girls work hard enough. So the implication of this is that those teachers assume that boys have more natural math abilities. Research explains that this could explain half of the gender achievement gap from kindergarten to third grade. We're not going to discuss the gender pay gap too much in this slide, but it is important to note that even when women have similar degrees, so they've studied the same field or they've obtained the same level of degree, whether it be a bachelor's degree, professional degree, or doctoral degree, men are paid more than females. And so as an educator, it's important that you inform your students of this gender pay gap and advise them about ways that they could work to eliminate this so that women receive equal pay for equal work. There are several ways that you can reduce the gender achievement gap as an educator. Teachers should give both genders equal amounts of positive feedback and encouragement, especially in areas where each gender has historically underperformed. It's also important as an educator that you ensure that each gender has equitability in roles, so that each group has an opportunity to have different positions in the classroom or different roles or jobs, such as passing out papers, taking notes, managing the experiment, being in charge of the materials or in technology. As long as students are each getting an opportunity and they're each having an equal likelihood of having each role, you're going to help to eliminate that problem that we discussed earlier, where unfortunately women are more likely to take passive roles and males are more likely to take active roles in the experiments and activities. Some other recommendations are that teachers should call on girls as much as they call on boys, and to note how much they call each student. In effect, it would be ideal to call on each student at equal amounts. This way, not one student or one group of students dominates discussions, and each type of student or each student in general has an equal likelihood of being of receiving praise from the teacher. Furthermore, teachers should emphasize the contributions of women in specific content areas that teacher teaches. For example, they can explain how women have been successful in science and math. And that would be very beneficial because women can see that they have role models that share the same gender. A sixth recommendation is that parents at home should also make sure that they're encouraging their girls to pursue college majors and careers in math and science. They shouldn't just relegate those girls to fields that historically women have represented in the workforce. Moreover, parents should further make additional efforts to help boys and encourage boys to complete their homework. Because as we've discussed in earlier slides, there's a disproportionate number of boys who are underperforming in all three subjects, math, science, and language arts. And boys are also more likely to receive lower grades than girls. Our second topic will be the topic of socioeconomic diversity in U.S. schools. So socioeconomics implies both the income of the family as well as the social class of the family. Normally, though, we mostly focus on the parental income when we talk about socioeconomic diversity in the United States. In terms of the numbers, in 2016, 17% of students lived in extreme poverty, and that they experienced food insecurity during part of the year. Something to note as an educator is that certain types of schools, called Title I schools, are designated as such because they have over 40% of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. Title I schools receive additional additional federal funding for having a high proportion of students that are at or below the poverty level. There are more than 56,000 schools that participate in the Title I program. Something to use as a benchmark of whether or not students qualify for reduced price lunch is that in 2018-2019, a family of four with an income at or below $46,435 would have their children qualify for reduced price lunch. And so those children would participate in the free and reduced price lunch program. In 2010-2011, nearly half of all U.S. students qualified for free or reduced price lunch. As the graphic indicates, there's a significant disparity in academic achievement based on socioeconomic levels, including family income. As you can see, when you look at the SAT exam, one of the mandatory exams that colleges use to determine admission, students that come from families that earn more than $200,000 per year, on average score 200 points, approximately 200 points higher on both the math SAT and the reading SAT than students who have parents who earn between $0 to $20,000 per year. As you can see, the pattern is on this graph, the more family income, the more likely to score higher on the SAT. This slide further explains that on the NAEP, which we discussed before, that national achievement test that's given throughout the nation and across several grades, students who are low income perform at least 20 points below students who are not low income or students who are middle class or higher in terms of income levels. Also, if you look at the college achievement and college participation, in the top tier colleges or tier 1 colleges, only 9% of freshmen in the top colleges come from the bottom half of the SES or the bottom half of the socioeconomic distribution. Let's now discuss ways that we can support students of diverse socioeconomic backgrounds so that all students are successful, regardless of their family's income. One way to do this is to provide access to technology for students before, during, and after school. This is important because students from low-income families are less likely to have internet access at home and less likely to have computers as well. And so if you provide technology access to students before, during, and after school, and you make sure that it's equitable in terms of who receives the opportunity to use the technology in the classroom, allowing equal opportunities for all students, then you know that students will have the advantage of being able to learn through the use of technology when they might not have had those advantages at home. A second way to assure that students of diverse socioeconomic backgrounds are successful is that teachers make sure that they're aware and inform families of the district's resources. So many districts offer free tutoring to families. They also offer free school supplies. And if they do not offer those free school supplies or maybe subsidized school supplies, there are going to often be nonprofit organizations, even corporations sometimes, that will offer these services. Nonprofits generally offer the tutoring, and then sometimes big corporations will have yearly back to school supply drives where they donate supplies to teachers. And so as a teacher, it's important to become aware of those opportunities or in which you can receive free school supplies that you can give to your students who may not be able to afford them. Furthermore, school districts and many schools often offer snack packs, which helps deal with the food insecurity for some students who might not have guaranteed food on the weekends when the free and reduced lunches are not offered at schools. Furthermore, it's important that teachers also understand that not every student has access to affordable healthcare or has access to affordable mental health care as well. And so it's important that you inform families that often many communities will have subsidized clinics or even free services for families that have children in a school district. Sometimes school districts partner with universities that provide the mental health care counseling to students. Third, as a teacher, it's important to look at your homework policy and make sure that it's effectively supporting all students. So one way to look at that is consider what kind of homework assignments you're sending home to your students. Are they homework assignments that all students can complete, that they have the resources and the abilities to do it on their own? You can't always assume that students will have internet access, technology such as computers and word processors, or parental support to help them complete their assignment. In general, students from low incomes are less likely to have access to the internet, and they're also less likely to have parents who can support them in completing their homework. Either their parents are having to work longer hours to make ends meet, or often people from low economic backgrounds are less likely to hold advanced degrees or even high school degrees. And so you cannot always assume that the parents will be able to support students in completing the homework. Furthermore, if you notice that a student is struggling in turning in their homework and you realize that it's something to do with the resources or support they have at home, you could always extend the time or provide opportunities for that student to come in before or after school to get your help in completing the homework. I would also recommend that you do not make homework a high percentage of students' total grade. I would say 20% or less. And the reason being is that, first of all, if students do not have that support or those resources to complete homework and they don't necessarily have a stable home environment, they could be disproportionately affected by having such a high percentage of homework. If you keep it at a low percentage level, however, you could still encourage students to complete it, but you wouldn't severely punish students who don't have the support and the resources at home to complete homework every day. Moreover, homework is not always the best measure of what students actually know. As you may know, many times parents help students complete homework, and so homework can often be a symbol of how much parental support students receive rather than how much students actually know. So if you place it at such a high percentage, let's say over 20%, which I would consider high, you are not necessarily guaranteeing that the grade that students receive represents what they actually know. Fourth, it's very important that you encourage students to pursue higher education. And so some ways to do this are to have college days at your school, in which maybe the teachers wear their college t-shirts, or even students and their families wear college t-shirts that they're aware of. Furthermore, it's important that you inform families and students, especially high school students, about opportunities to attend college and the idea of a college culture and the benefits of college. It's also really important that you explain that higher education and continued learning in general is beneficial, regardless if students attend community college, a four-year college, a technical school, or the military. You should encourage students to pursue their interests and to pursue higher education, regardless of whether you yourself attended that type of school. There are many high paying jobs and very rewarding jobs that only require a certification or a 2-year degree or military training. And so it's important that you inform your students of those options so that they can see that they have the ability to pick which one best meets their interests and their personal needs. However, for those students that do want to go to community college and four-year universities or even trade schools, it's very important that you inform them of the financial aid process, as well as how to apply to colleges, what standardized tests they need to take to gain admission into colleges, and also ways they can subsidize the cost of taking the standardized tests. For some families, $95 or, I'm not sure exact price of the ACT or the SAT. Either way, let's say it's around $100. That can be a significant burden for many families. And so it's important that as an educator, you help students apply for those subsidized costs and for that financial aid so they have equal access to attend college. At the classroom level, you can also have a classroom library in which you stock your classroom with high interest grade level books for students, and then students can take turns reading them and borrowing them and taking them home. Yes, schools will have libraries, but it's not always guaranteed that students will feel comfortable using the library's resources, or they might not necessarily know which books are most appropriate for them. And so as a teacher, you know their reading level, and so you can help recommend what kind of books would be appropriate for students. Also, libraries don't always stock the most up-to-date, high-interest literature for students, and so you as an educator can stay abreast of popular works in fiction and nonfiction so that you can supply those to your students. When you have high-interest learning, students are more likely when you have high-interest books, students are more likely to read it, and they're more likely to develop their reading abilities. Now let's talk about racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity in U.S. schools. If you look on the graphic on the right, you can see that the percentage of school-age students in the United States are becoming much more diverse, especially since the years 1990. Nearly half of all students in public schools are students of color. They're either Latino, Asian, or African American. This slide unfortunately doesn't show the Native American population, but they are also significant as well. I believe they're about 3% of the student population. If you look at both slides, you can see that unfortunately there's been a racial achievement gap in the United States. Historically, whites and Asians have outperformed Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans. If you look at both graphs, you can see there's a significant difference between those groups. However, something to note is that studies have shown that a significant portion of this racial achievement gap could also be attributed to socioeconomic differences between the groups. One thing to note that's positive is that the racial achievement gap is decreasing. As you can see in the larger graph of the two, since 2003 and 2011, Hispanics, African Americans, and students who receive free and reduced lunch have had larger increases in their scores compared to whites and all students in general. And so if these increases continue at this level, then eventually, ideally, students of all races will be at similar academic achievement levels. And you as an educator can work to reduce the racial achievement gap. It's important as educators that we understand the historical context of the racial achievement gap. Prior to 1865, or prior to the end of the Civil War, African Americans in the South were living as slaves. They were not allowed to learn how to read or write, and they were not allowed to attend schools. Educational opportunities for free African Americans in the North were not necessarily that much better. In 1865, after the emancipation of all African Americans in the South, the Southern groups in charge created a system of legalized segregation. The segregation separated people based on their race, and it ended up providing reduced services and reduced educational opportunities for African Americans and Hispanics, while whites received better schools, better materials, and more experienced teachers. There was also segregation in the North. Often it wasn't necessarily part of the law, but it was part of residential patterns. There were some residential laws that restricted African Americans and Hispanics from moving into white neighborhoods. So segregation in the North could also be considered de jure or judicial as well, in terms of being stipulated by the law. Something that you should also note is that English language learners, up until about the 1950s and 1960s, in general were barred from speaking their native language in schools. Sometimes they would be punished, both physically or emotionally, for trying to use their native language instead of just using only English. Let's look at these pictures. I wanted to show a visual representation of the vast discrepancies under segregation. If you look at the left, the African American school is much smaller. It's less well kept, or less remodeled, I guess you could say, than the white school. And also, if you look at the number of students in the classroom, it's very overcrowded. It has looks like over 100 students to one teacher, and the resources, the books, the desks, the heating and air that they have is much different than what you can see on the right and the white school. And the white school, they obviously have more resources, better facilities, and a smaller student to teacher ratio. And this just shows you that there was a huge discrepancy in resources under segregation. And this discrepancy contributed to part of the educational achievement gap according to racial lines. In 1954, a groundbreaking Supreme Court case ended segregation. Brown versus Board of Education integrated schools and declared that separate but equal, the system that had supported segregation, was overturned. In the case, educational researchers proved that segregation not only caused severe psychological harms for African Americans and Hispanics, but also led to reduced educational opportunities for those groups. After segregation ended, universities, both public and private, took a step to redress and correct some of the educational iniquities that had occurred under segregation. The policies they enacted were called affirmative action policies. Affirmative action policies are ways in which universities, both public and private, work to increase the percentage of their students who are African American, Hispanic, Native American, and sometimes also Asian American. The affirmative action policies have sometimes come up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of affirmative action but has set stipulations on how affirmative action can be implemented. So first of all, the Supreme Court ruled that students benefit, regardless of their race, they benefit from attending universities that have diversity, that have students of diverse cultures, backgrounds, opinions, and experiences. And so institutions of higher education, colleges and universities, have a right to work to increase the diversity of their student population. However, when universities and colleges work to improve the diversity of their student population, it has to be taken at a holistic perspective. So they have to look at applicants holistically. They cannot just use race as the single factor for admitting a student into a university. Moreover, colleges and universities cannot set particular quotas or percentages for each racial group, even if they are trying to overrepresent certain groups that are underrepresented often in higher education, let's say African Americans and Hispanics, for example. Even if they're trying to have a student population that is larger than the national population of African Americans or Hispanics, they still are not allowed to do that. Quotas or percentages of a certain group are restricted according to the Supreme Court. As educators, we should work to reduce the racial achievement gap in U.S. schools. And the way we can do that is by promoting diversity, multiculturalism, and the success for all learners. Let's discuss some specific ways we can achieve this. First, educators should be aware of the different cultures that their students have, as well as culturally appropriate communication and lessons. You want to make sure that students have exposure to the cultural references you make in your lessons, and you also want to try to incorporate students' culture, traditions, and experiences into the lessons you provide. Moreover, it's very important that you understand as an educator that different cultures have different learning styles. For example, male European and Japanese Americans are more likely to prefer independent learning activities. However, African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans are much more likely to appreciate communal learning. Furthermore, African Americans enjoy, in particular, hands-on learning activities and kinesthetic learning activities. They also like to be first taught the big picture or the whole concept, and then later learn the individual parts of a concept. Hispanics also enjoy receiving concrete examples in their learning, and they appreciate working in groups. Native Americans enjoy working in groups, but in small groups. And when being recognized or presenting their information, they prefer to present it privately rather than publicly in front of everyone. Moreover, they have been shown to use mental images to help them learn. As we mentioned slightly in the past slide, it's important that content is culturally appropriate and that you as a teacher are providing a culturally appropriate learning context. You want to make sure you're appealing to students' individual learning style and preferences, and you also want to recognize and promote their culture. One way to do this is to have the cognitive apprenticeship model. And in this model, you focus on real world applications of the material. And you focus also on understanding students' prior learning experiences and prior life experiences. And you connect the new content to what they have seen before in their lives, both inside school and outside school. In addition, you want to have a culturally responsive curriculum. You want to promote literature from diverse authors. You also want to encourage different languages, and you also want to teach students non-Western history. Unfortunately, often Western European history is often emphasized in schools rather than the history of Latin America, Africa, or Asia. And so, as a teacher, you can also ensure that your students are learning history from non-Western countries. Moreover, as we mentioned with reducing the gender achievement gap, another way that you can reduce the racial achievement gap is to focus on the historical contributions of all different races and cultures. Moreover, you can emphasize different cultural traditions and different celebrations, especially ones that your students participate in. And if you do not know about those traditions or celebrations, you can ask your students or do your own research and try to incorporate them into your instruction. As a teacher, you must also recognize that there are misconceptions and misunderstandings when it comes to students who are culturally and linguistically diverse. There is no academic ability difference between the groups, or there's no difference in IQ or intelligence between students of different races or different cultural backgrounds or different language backgrounds. It's important that you, as an educator, understand that all students can learn at equal levels, and that the reason that there are these racial achievement gaps are societal reasons and also a lack of resources, like we've discussed before. Moreover, when you have particular student populations in your classroom, it's important to research the history of those groups, the languages they speak, their cultural traditions. That way you can get to know more about your students and better connect your lessons to what their home experiences and cultural experiences are. One way to do this is to have bio cards where you could have questions about students that they would answer themselves, including their interests, their hobbies, information about their family, what they consider their culture or their community, the languages they speak at home, the traditions they practice, or the holidays they practice. And so those bio cards are a good way to get to know your students so that you can connect your lessons to their life experiences. Another thing that's to note is that you should have high expectations for all students. Even though that historically certain groups have underperformed, that doesn't mean that that is their ability level or that there is a ceiling on their ability to perform. Rather, you should encourage all students to be successful and equip them with the ability, the lessons, and the background, academic background, so that they are successful. As a teacher, you also want to increase opportunities for family interaction and family support in the schools. So, one way to do this is to increase opportunities for families to interact by providing language translators or encouraging family engagement nights. And you should offer those family engagement nights at different times of the day because not all parents have the same schedule or the same type of job. And so if you offer them at different times of the day, that facilitates more parents becoming involved in their students' education. Moreover, it's important that you also recognize the diverse languages that students might have, and you also, regardless of whatever language background, cultural background, or racial background, you ensure that your activities involve critical thinking. They're academically rigorous, and that students are asked to um, think creatively and to think abstractly. You should avoid things that require minimum thought and are just focused on basic recall and remembering of facts, such as worksheets. Unfortunately, there's a disproportionate amount of students who are African American, Hispanic, and Native American that are being recognized as gifted and talented. And so when you see that there's a student who's gifted and talented, ensure that they get identified and be their advocate. This way you can ensure that there is more likelihood of equitability of access to GT programs, gifted and talented programs that teach curriculum at an advanced level. Now let's talk about language diversity in U.S. schools. An important concept when we talk about language in U.S. schools is the classification of an English language learner, or ELL. An English language learner is a student who has a native language or home language that is different than English. Moreover, it's a student that qualifies for language assistant programs, such as ESL programs or bilingual programs. It's also important that educators understand the characteristics of English language learners in K-12 schools. So, nearly 10% of the entire US student population are English language learners, and in Texas, nearly 20% of all students are English language learners. The vast majority of English language learners speak Spanish as a home language. The next three most spoken languages are Arabic, Chinese, and Vietnamese. In Texas, the second most spoken language after Spanish is Vietnamese. Something also to note is that most students that are classified as English language learners were actually born in the United States. So 76% of elementary English language learners are US citizens and were born in the United States, and 56% of English language learners in high school were also born in the United States. Unfortunately, there's an academic achievement gap between English language learners and native English speakers. This slide depicts 2017 data on the STAR Standardized Achievement Test for Texas. We used the passing score of approaches grade level as the passing rate. In Texas, overall, ELL students score nearly 20% below all students. Moreover, if you look at graduation rates, ELL students have graduation rates that are 15% below the average graduation rate in Texas. They were, in fact, the lowest subgroup of all different ethnicities and also students that receive special education services. They were that subgroup, English language learners, was the lowest subgroup in terms of graduation rate in Texas. This graph just depicts and demonstrates that in the United States, there are 6 other languages other than English that have more than 1 million speakers. And as I just talked about in the other slide, the vast majority of speakers of languages other than English speak Spanish. Approximately a third of Texas households speak a language other than English at home. Similar to the US, Spanish is the most common language other than English spoken at home. And second is Vietnamese, followed by Chinese. Now we are going to discuss best practices to promote academic success for English language learners. First, it's important that an educator considers students' background knowledge and experiences that they bring to the school setting. So consider their family background, their family structure, who can help them at home, and also their home language and their level of home literacy in their native language. You also want to think about, do they have the academic vocabulary in their native language? Or what kind of language practices, including writing or reading, such as literacy, do they have in their native language? You also want to consider what prior content knowledge they've received in earlier grades or at home, and what academic learning experiences they have been exposed to. Often, if students have a high language background in their native language, if they have a high proficiency in their native language, those skills can transfer to their second language, English. So students with a high academic vocabulary in their first language and who are on grade level in their first language are more likely to learn English at a faster pace and they're also more likely to be proficient in English in the near future. Now let's discuss some instructional strategies to help English language learners. One way to support English language learners is to pre-teach the academic vocabulary before you teach a new content lesson. This way, if students are familiar with the words that are being used in the content lesson, they're more likely to understand what you're teaching and more likely to retain that information. Furthermore, it's beneficial that you provide native language support to students. And you can provide native language support even if you do not speak students' native language. You can provide students with text in their native language. You can set them up with peers who are also native speakers of the same language but maybe have higher proficiency in English. You can provide instructional videos that from YouTube or from other sources that are in students' native language. As we've discussed in the last sentence or so, it's important that you pair English language learners with speakers who are at a higher English language ability. Or so you want to pair English language learners, especially students who are beginners or intermediate speakers, with someone who's more advanced. You want to have mixed ability grouping so that students can learn from their peers. And the interaction that they have with their academic partners will help support their language development in English. Another way to support English language learners is to provide graphic organizers. These help English language learners understand the text structure, so how both fiction and nonfiction texts are organized, and it also can be a way to demonstrate their thinking in a visual way. It's also important that educators provide contextual support for English language learners to help support their comprehension of what's being taught. So contextual support could include visuals, multimedia such as videos, gestures, or repeated modeling. It could also include hands-on learning or kinesthetic learning experiences where students are performing the action with the support of a teacher or performing the learning activity with the help of their educator. Another thing that's important is that you make the new information relevant to students' prior knowledge and to their culture and traditions. I mentioned in class that some cultures have different background knowledge, especially when it comes to cultural traditions. The example I used was the Tooth Fairy in the United States and El Ratoncito Pérez in Latin America. So as an elementary school teacher, if you are discussing the concept of the Tooth Fairy or you're reading a book about the Tooth Fairy, it's important that you understand or you teach to your students how we view the Tooth Fairy or our perception of the Tooth Fairy in the United States and connect it to what students might have in their home countries. Moreover, it's important to connect traditions. So many cultures have similar traditions such as Thanksgiving, in which they give thanks, or especially during a harvest time, to a higher power. And it's a time for community and social connection. And so you can connect holidays, even though they might have different names, or not, or might be slightly different, or have different representations in different cultures. You can connect them together and discuss similarities, so that students can connect to the literature that might discuss those holidays in the United States. Other instructional strategies for English language learners include providing additional modeling or guided practice opportunities so that students are successful. You could also provide manipulatives when solving especially math problems, but you could also use other types of manipulatives. So manipulatives could be base 10 blocks, it could be counters, it could also be things like sentence strips or alphabet letters or magnet letters. You could provide models and experiments. Those are all forms of manipulatives. Moreover, you could adjust your pace of instruction to ensure that all students can comprehend what you're saying. So you could slow down, especially during difficult parts, and pause regularly and check for understanding to make sure that students are keeping up with you and understanding what you're saying. You could provide small group support for students so that they receive more lower student to teacher ratios and more individual support. Also, students in small groups are more likely to be engaged compared to students in the whole group setting. Furthermore, you could provide group projects and task-based activities that are relative to the real world. You could give them a problem or a situation they might face in the real world, and they have to come up with solutions. And if they work with groups, it's a collaborative way to help engage learners while also making it relevant to the real world. And students can, once again, build off the language abilities of their peers. So if you have a mixed ability grouping, students with low English proficiency will learn new words and correct grammar from students with a high English proficiency. And then students with a higher English proficiency will also learn more in depth the information by having to reteach it to other people while also building confidence. Moreover, to help support English language learners, you could also pre-teach the organization of text. So with fiction texts, normally they follow a similar pattern where the fiction will begin by describing the characters and the setting, and then there will also be a problem that the character faces, and then while the character's working on that problem, it builds up into a climax, and then after that, there's some kind of resolution of the problem. Nonfiction also has a particular sequence. For example, often nonfiction will start paragraphs with an intro sentence, which will provide the main argument or idea, and then the following sentences will be supporting details or evidence that supports the main idea, proving that it's true. Furthermore, nonfiction also has particular types of text features like captions, which describe the pictures or the photos, and headings, which help organize information into sections. Moreover, as a teacher, you could also go over subject-specific vocabulary or context-specific vocabulary. So in science or technology, for example, the word revolution means go around in a circle or complete one complete cycle. However, in social studies, revolution means something entirely different, where it's individual people or groups of people fighting the existing social system or government. And so in each content area, you need to explain the specific vocabulary that's high use and high frequency. And also you want to make sure that you explain how certain words have different meanings across contexts. The state of Texas adopts policies to best serve English language learners. When English language learners enter schools, they go through a home language survey, which is kind of like a test to see their background language skills. Based on their response on that home language survey and how they do on the entry test, students are placed by the Language Proficiency Assessment Committee, the LPAC committee, in either bilingual classes, ESL classes, or general education classes. The LPAC committee is composed of classroom teachers, ESL or bilingual teachers, administrators, and a parent from the local community. If students are in bilingual or ESL programs, they'll take the TELPAS exam, which is a yearly exam to measure students' English language proficiency. The TELPAS has 4 levels: beginning, intermediate, advanced, and advanced high. Furthermore, the TELPAS discusses the 4 domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. There are separate tests for each of those domains that the TELPAS provides to students. Based on students' results, school districts are held accountable for whether students are going up 1 level in their proficiency. Also, based on students' results, the LPAC committee decides whether students will remain in either bilingual classes or ESL classes, or if students will be reclassified and they'll either go into an ESL classroom or a general education classroom based on students' performance. Now we're going to get into the different TELPAS English proficiency levels. Students with beginning English proficiency and their listening will need significant contextual support. So they'll need visuals, gestures, pantomime, or real objects, as well as repeated modeling to understand basic conversations and directions. Moreover, students will probably have trouble distinguishing between sentences and individual words. When speaking, a beginner English language learner will primarily speak in only single word or short, simple sentences, and most of the speech will be high frequency words or words they recently learned. Many people will find this type of speaker difficult to understand due to their pronunciation, unless they're just saying words that they've memorized recently. Students with beginning English language proficiency in their reading will most likely be reading below grade level. If they can read text, then it would be simple text with high frequency words. They'll need to be taught, for example, with read alouds or with more simple text. They need to be presented in chunks or small bits of information at each time. And they'll further need additional contextual support to understand even basic passages. In their writing ability, they'll have difficulty expressing themselves at grade level writing prompts. They might even have difficulty just writing in English print. And the sentences they do write, if they are complete sentences, will often be somewhat confusing for the reader. Now let's discuss students who have intermediate English proficiency. Students with intermediate English proficiency are still needing contextual support when they're listening, and that contextual support will help them understand basic conversations and basic directions. However, the student might still have trouble distinguishing the difference between separate words or phrases. Moreover, in speaking, the student will be able to hold basic short conversations, but there might be regular pauses. The student will probably still make some second language errors in terms of grammar mistakes, and this could interfere with understanding. However, if an educator is familiar with English language learners, then they probably will be able to understand this student when they're speaking. In terms of reading, an intermediate English language learner will be able to recognize common words or high frequency words. They'll also be able to read short text or short sentences, but most likely they'll be reading below grade level. They might even have trouble decoding the sounds and matching them with the letters or symbols or spelling patterns. So they might have trouble reading phonetically because their phonics system from their native language is different than English. When they're writing, an intermediate English language learner will have only the ability to write short sentences or short paragraphs. They'll be primarily using high frequency language and recently practiced words. They'll primarily only be using the present tense. And if they use the other tenses, such as the past tense, they will often misuse those tenses. They'll have a limited ability to go into detail and to have an elaboration in their writing. Most of their writing will be, however, understood by educators who are familiar with English language learners' writing. Students with advanced English proficiency, when they're listening, they'll be able to understand longer conversations and longer lessons and also more detailed instructions. They still might need some contextual support like visuals, repeated modeling, gestures, pantomime, or real objects, but for the most part, they'll be able to understand most of what is said during the lesson. They still may benefit from having slower pace of speech, and they probably will occasionally ask the speaker to clarify or repeat what was said because occasionally there might be a breakdown in communication. In terms of speaking, English language learners who are advanced will most likely be understood by most people, even if they are not necessarily familiar with English language learners. Also, they'll be able to hold basic everyday conversations, and they'll start to be having more elaborate academic conversations. They'll also be able to explain and discuss in detail unfamiliar subjects. They will still make occasional errors, especially when grammar becomes more complicated or if they're writing in long sentences or using less familiar words or speech. English language learners with advanced English proficiency will still benefit from reading with contextual support. They'll be able to understand, however, most grade level texts, so they'll be reading on grade level for the most part. They'll also mostly be reading correctly most words, and they'll be able to read them phonetically using their knowledge of English phonics. Students will be able to understand also most main points and supporting details of texts, especially when the texts are read out loud to them. A student with advanced English language proficiency in their writing will still benefit from contextual support, but they'll be able to participate in most grade level writing activities. They'll be able to describe in more detail their points of view or their position, and they'll be able to use most grammar conventions with increased accuracy. However, they still will probably make some mistakes in terms of verb tenses or more complicated grammatical errors. Now, an English language learner with advanced high English proficiency has abilities that are nearly comparable to a native English speaker. Let's break it down first with listening. So a student who has advanced high will be able to listen and understand long lessons and also more elaborate directions and conversations. And the conversations or directions or instruction can be in both familiar subjects and unfamiliar subjects or academic topics. They'll rarely or never really need to ask the speaker to clarify or repeat because of a lack of understanding. In terms of speaking, an advanced high person with advanced high English language proficiency will be able to hold extended discussions and elaborate orally in detail about their point of view or what they're trying to get across in terms of communication. They'll be able to use a wide variety of English grammar structures and also be able to speak with complex sentences. And their speech will be very similar to a native speaker. They may occasionally mispronounce words, but they're almost always using words in the correct tense, and they're they're nearly always being very accurate in the speech that they present to other people. An ELL student with advanced high English proficiency in their reading will be able to read and comprehend grade level texts, and their comprehension will be comparable to that of a native English speaking person. They'll also be able to understand the main idea and supporting details of grade appropriate text, and they won't necessarily need to have significant contextual support. They'll be able to read just the text itself without visual supports or modeling or pantomime or realia. They'll also be able to decode and understand most grade level appropriate words. And so they'll be able to read out loud correctly the words that they're seeing in the text based on their knowledge of English phonics. In terms of writing, an advanced high English language learner will have grade level appropriate writing and will need little support from teachers or peers or contextual support. They'll be able to elaborate with detail and clarity, and they'll also be very precise in the types of grammar structures, spelling patterns, and sentence structure that they use in their writing. They may make occasional errors, especially when they're writing about abstract topics that are highly academic, or also topics that involve low frequency words or grammar concepts. Although they may make occasional errors in grammar, especially when it comes to sometimes like the naturalness of phrasing, their errors will not interfere with the overall meaning. And for the most part, their errors will not be too blatant so that someone would notice too severely that it would interfere with someone's understanding of what they wrote. Finally, we're going to discuss students who have diverse physical and learning abilities. So these could be people who might need physical accommodations due to differences in hearing ability or physical movement ability or eyesight. Also, it could be students who have certain learning differences. So first, let's quickly start with some laws that defend and support the rights of students with learning differences. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 stipulated that all students with disabilities or learning differences would have an equal educational opportunities, and they would also receive an equally significant and proficient quality of education. The All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 also ensured that better services would be provided to students with disabilities. Before, unfortunately, in some schools, students with disabilities and learning differences were separated and often were provided subpar educational and instructional activities. But thanks to the All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, it increased the standards and the requirements for special education in the United States. Furthermore, the American Disability Act of 1990 made it against the law to discriminate against someone for having a disability or learning difference. In fact, students who have learning differences or disabilities must be placed in a least restrictive environment. This means that they will be placed as much as possible with their age-level peers. So students who maybe have a learning difference or a physical difference will still be placed as much as possible with people who are of the same age and with people who do not have learning differences or learning or physical differences. Now we'll discuss policies that help serve students with diverse physical and learning abilities. If students qualify for special education, then educators must follow students' individualized education program. The Individualized Education Program, or IEP, details what type of instruction or what type of environment students will receive their instruction and for what part of the day. It also details what types of accommodations students will receive. Some accommodations could include extra time, um, additional learning resources, text read out loud, and support from a special education aide or a special education teacher. Even if students do not qualify for special education, you will probably see that many students have different learning abilities. And you'll have some students that still are academically struggling, probably, but they might not necessarily qualify for special education services because they do not necessarily have a learning difference. So, in order to address the needs of those students, a teacher must provide differentiation. So, differentiation means basically that you're providing unique types of instruction based on students' interests, their ability levels, their background knowledge, and also their language abilities. So an example of differentiation could include providing different text complexities or different text levels. Even though the content might be the same, there might be various levels of difficulty of the text in terms of the words being used and the length of the sentences. And when you differentiate that, students will still receive the key takeaways and the key concepts from that lesson, but they'll also make it so that it's more accessible so that if they need to, they could read it independently and still be successful in understanding the content. Moreover, differentiation also implies providing different types of learning experiences in terms of the size of the grouping. So often teachers will differentiate by providing small group work or partner work. Another type of differentiation based on learning experience could be the types of instruction and the types of activities. So hands-on learning experiences with manipulatives like base 10 blocks or sentence strips or letters that can be moved around are often used by teachers to help provide further support for students who are possibly struggling with a concept. Moreover, another type of differentiation could be providing first language support or translations for English language learners. You could also, once again, provide peer support for those students, and that would be a form of differentiation. Another type of differentiation is just repeated modeling and reviewing fundamental concepts and reviewing those concepts before you introduce more difficult material or new concepts. So an example of this might be if you notice that students are struggling with learning how to regroup with subtraction, it might be important that you assess if students are already pretty effective at doing subtraction without regrouping. Once you can tell that students know how to do that operation and they understand conceptually the concept of subtraction and that it's the number is getting smaller, it's taking it away, then you can start to expand and introduce the more difficult concept of regrouping. Finally, educators will follow the response to intervention system as a way to help support students with diverse academic abilities. So the RTI system, or response to intervention system, divides students into 3 tiers, and it's based on academic ability, and it's relative to students' grade level readiness. A key component of RTI is that students are regularly assessed so that educators can look at the data from the assessment and review that data to see students' progress. Let's discuss the 3 tiers of RTI. So Tier 1 of RTI normally composes about 80% of students. These students are on grade level and they can be successful in whole group interaction, and for the most part they can work independently when they're provided grade level concepts and they are provided with some guided practice from the teacher. Tier 2 are normally compose about 15% of students. Tier 2 students are normally less than a year behind the grade level. And these students benefit from having small group interaction that occurs at least weekly. And they need high quality interventions in which educators will pick specific skills that they need support or additional practice, and then teachers will provide research-based best instruction and measure students' progress to see if they are progressing in learning that skill. If students do not respond to that intervention where they're receiving small group support and targeted instruction at least once or twice a week, then students move to Tier 3. This is 5% of the student population normally. These students are often more than a year behind grade level, and they require intensive interventions. I prefer to say that they would require almost daily small group interaction or even individual support with the teacher. And not only are they still working with targeted instruction, the instruction needs to be differentiated and probably meet the student at their current academic level. And so, since students are normally more than a year below grade level, you'll need to provide instruction and provide differentiated resources that are even below the targeted grade level that you're teaching. Students are monitored heavily when they are Tier 3, almost at like a monthly frequency, and teachers must document the progress of students. If students do not make progress in Tier 3 intervention, one outcome that could result is that the student is referred to special education testing. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you benefited from this PowerPoint. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me at aweiss@wtamu.edu. And stay tuned for the next competency in the coming week or so. I'll try to put out the video soon. Thank you.